Let's talk about sewing machine needles. Up to this point, we have just been having you use a Microtex Sharp as we did our wovens and our pant, our drawstring pant. But now that we're moving on to knits, we really need to understand sewing machine needles. Because in all honesty, the basic needle affects a great deal of your knit sewing quality. It can either make it or break it. So let's get started. We're going to move this away. So the sewing machine needle, let's just talk about the parts. And there are like 4 basic kinds that we have talked about, but we haven't really dissected them. Why? We've mentioned a little bit about why, but you need to know exactly what each one does so that you can make the best choice. Usually we sew with a specialized needle in knits, but that can vary. So let's just talk about the ones that we have talked about. We have talked about universal. We've talked about the ballpoint or jersey needle. We've talked about the stretch needle. And we've mentioned maybe a tiny bit about a denim or a heavy needle, but what we really talked about is this Microtex needle. So let's just look at the needle first and really get a little more identification why the needle does different things if it's constructed differently. Now the top part up here, this is considered the top of the full needle called the shank. So this part right up here, it's the part that goes into your machine. And there's usually a flat side, which you can't really tell really well from the side view, but that is flat there. And then there's the rounded side. And in most machines, as you've probably figured out, that flat side goes away from you. There are a couple of machines that it's different, and you would just probably have found that out already by looking in your manual and making sure that you're inserting your needle correctly. Then we progress on down the needle, and the long part here, that is called the shaft. And the diameter or the thickness of the needle, how big around it is, that is called the blade portion. And the blade is part of all of this shaft, but the blade is considered the size that you do, like if it says it's a 14 or a 70 or whatever that is that you're using, that is signified. That number comes from measuring around the shaft. It's the circumference around the shaft of the needle, and then the measurement is the diameter inside of that circle that it creates. And in sewing machine needles, the bigger the number, the bigger the needle is around. Okay, it's probably always going to be the same length. The shaft really doesn't change that much. It's actually the circumference or the blade, they call it, of the needle, how big around that is. Now the needles have a front groove in them. See this here? There's a slight groove, and you can feel it. Sometimes you can really notice it too. If the light catches it right, you will see that groove in your needle. And then of course there's the eye, and most go into machines so you're threading through the eye. If eye is facing you, here it is. The eye would be there because this is a side view. And then of course we have the point of the needle. This is one thing that varies. It's called the scarf. Now that can vary a great deal on needles, and may be really not noticeable on a lot of needles. It usually tends to change in the more specialized needles. Okay, then over here, as we've started to point out, these are the major different kinds of needles that we work with generally. There are some more specialty needles than this, but this is to give you the big difference. What is different between each of these? And it has to do with the actual point on most of them. There is a little bit different of a shape in the groove and maybe the scarf, but definitely the groove when we talk about the stretch needles. So the universal needle, let's just go through these just a little bit. The universal needle can work on knits. It usually doesn't go into your rotation as the first needle you try. Why it might be available to use on your knits is because it's neither sharp nor completely round. And so it may be that in-between thing that does work for you, but you shouldn't start with it. In fact, this is that tool that they thought would solve all problems, and it's neither of any of them. So it really only works on very few projects correctly. You might want to check that in case you have been sewing with universal needles and not really understanding the difference. It could be part of your poor tension or the shape of your stitch, how it looks on the project if you're using a universal and not one that is meant exactly for your textile. So then we go to the jersey or the ballpoint. It may say jersey, it may say ballpoint, and this is the most rounded end. When you touch it, it's still going to feel sharp, but it is a rounded end so that going through knits, it won't sever or break that thread and cause a run. Because remember, a knit process actually is one thread that is being interlooped. And so if you cut that one thread, you could start the thread to slide on out, and now you've got a run in your fabric. The stretch needle is a mixture. This is probably the most likely universal needle that people would use. It is a stretch needle, so it does have it is meant originally it's meant for spandex. And so it does have some roundness to it. It has more roundness than a universal. It has some sharpness to it. But stretch needles have this scarf. They definitely have that scarf there. And lots of times the front groove is even a bit different. But that scarf helps to control in the spandex, getting through lycra or rubbery textiles that you might be sewing. This is definitely constructed and engineered so that the thread that goes through and works on this particular needle has more time to actually hook below. So this is engineered so that the stretch needle can be a little bit less round and still do good stitching. A good place to start in the stretch needles is around an 11. They don't make a wide variety of it, but an 11 is the one that works for pretty much all knits that you might be working with that has spandex in it. So the microtex, let's go skip down to that because we really talk universal, ballpoint, stretch, / jersey up here, and the microtex or / sharp. That's what we've been having you use. Look how much finer that needle is than the universal. Look how sharp it is and how extended this sharp point is, where that's pretty fat yet. You really want that on a woven so that you can get between all of the threads that are woven, right? It pierces easily. You may not want this on your knit. However, there are times, certain knits, that you have to use a truly sharp needle. It's just not giving you a good stitch without using one. All right, those are those 4 basic ones. And now we're going to go into using jersey ballpoint and stretch, which is why I had you maybe getting both kinds so that you could test which one is responding the best on your knits. There are other needles here, and just to give you a little idea, the jeans and denim is just, it's a sharp, but it's bigger in its blade, it's bigger around, and they usually start at size 14 and on up. So Microtex Sharp, usually you can get a 14 in this, but denim starts taking over at a 14, 16, 18 size needle. And why that is denim is considered a much heavier fabrication. It can get quite weighty. You may choose to use a denim needle on a heavy canvas even, or certain fabrics that are very, very tightly woven and heavy. Okay, you might want to go right to that denim jeans needle. There are leather needles, which actually very sharp. In fact, the blade part of it does get larger, but the actual, and the scarf is there to help that thread stay down long enough to make a stitch. But the big thing is that this is it is almost like a blade, and it scrapes or punctures, pierces the leather. Kind of like if you had a tool that would leather punch it, right? It's a really strong needle to do that. And then there's needles out there that are called self-threading. And I guess this is okay if you really, really have a difficulty threading your needle. But you have to remember, as easy as that thread goes in on this, it comes out probably even easier. So while you're stitching, it can move around and all of a sudden be out, and then your thread gets caught up, and now you've got a problem with your stitching and your tension. So those are the basic shapes and why we talk about certain needles certain ways and why we will want to use certain needles. So let's just talk about the Schmetz needle. This is from Schmetz, and here's some Schmetz needles. This one happens to be a stretch. But in the last, this last 10 years or so, Schmetz came out with a color coding. It used to be other needles you have to actually look, and I think Clauses are that way yet. The Claus needle, and I think organ needles, Singer needles. You have to read the engraving on the actual shank up at the top part here. There will be engraving on what kind of size it is. You can maybe see that here. I don't know that you can through the camera, but it says it is engraved. This is a Schmetz needle, a 7511. And now they've given you a color code. So the top color on the band here is the needle type. The bottom color is the needle size. So if you have Schmetz needles, and like this one is yellow on the top, meaning that it is a stretch needle, it does say that. But if it had been in your machine and you're not sure what kind of needle you have in, if you're using Schmetz, you can look up online, you can find this chart. It's a very simple chart to read. So then it has I think purple underneath. And so purple, I'm not sure, sir. That's the purple now that I look at it. It must be this pink. Yeah, it is. It's the pink right there, the pink purple magenta. So it's yellow on top, and it happens to be just like that in this case. And that is a 7511, which this is. This is important to know because you may need to be switching your needles around, trying to find, sometimes when you change the thickness, maybe on one particular action, you may be needing a little bit stronger or bigger of a needle. Maybe in other operations, the better stitch would be with the lighter or smaller needle and not such a big hole that you're punching through something. How do you know which one to use? Well, let's just put for your knit, how should you determine which of these you really want to use? So we've got sharps are the same as Microtex, but we're just going to put these 4 up here right now. So we've got stretch, we've got jersey or ballpoint, we've got Microtex or sharps, and we have universals. The main answer to that is testing. Testing, testing, testing. It is the only way. There is a specific test to do to make sure that you are using the right needle. And when we do our first stitch exploration, I will be pointing that out. How you check if your needle is correct that you're using. Okay, that's Needle Know, and see you on the next thing.